I would like to welcome everybody that joined our joint All Aboard Minnesota and All Aboard Wisconsin meeting here today. My name is Mark Quam. I'm Vice President for All Aboard Wisconsin, and I also serve on the Board of Directors for All Aboard Minnesota as their Secretary. Today's discussion is Amtrak's proposed service reductions with the long distance trains, and our primary focus on this particular Zoom meeting with All Aboard Wisconsin and All Aboard Minnesota is to address the reduction in the Empire Builder service going from daily service down to 3 days. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today, and at this time I'm going to hand this over to Brian Nelson, President of All Aboard Minnesota, and Brian, you can take it from here.
Great, thank you, Mark. We really appreciate your attendance at this meeting this afternoon. This is a very important issue. We're talking about Amtrak's proposed service reductions to all the long distance trains, which would include the Empire Builder. So I'll be presenting some information along with Nona Hill, who's president of All Aboard Wisconsin, and Sean Jeans-Gail from Rail Passengers Association, vice president of Policy and Government Affairs, will give us an update in terms of what the current status is in Congress of funding for Amtrak. So with that, our agenda today is relatively simple. We're going to be discussing, why this is happening. What's some of the reasoning for it? What does this mean to the long distance trains? What is the impact to you? And most importantly, what we can do about it that might prevent this from happening. We'll, as Mark mentioned, we'll try and allow for as many questions and answers as we can. And then we'll also give you some more resources that you can reference. So why is this happening? As we know, in this COVID pandemic, it has really decimated our economy. Millions of people are out of work. The travel industry has been especially affected by this. Airlines have received some bailout money. Amtrak received $1 billion in the CARES Act in March. But since that time, airlines have come back and asked for another $30 billion. Airports have asked for another $10 billion. Amtrak came back and asked for another $1.47 billion earlier this year, but announced that even if they got that amount, that they would still need to lay off 20% of their workforce and cut long distance routes. So that has obviously alarmed a lot of people, but no question about it, Amtrak is definitely hurting. Ridership has fallen by 95%. Projected revenue for the next fiscal year is projected to be at 50%. So not a good scenario. So what is Amtrak saying? I just mentioned that Amtrak did come back after they received their initial $1 billion for an additional 1.47, but said, even if we get that, we're going to have to cut. So in a recent congressional hearing, Amtrak said in order to maintain the system as it is now and keep distance trains and not have drastic layoffs, they would need $4.9 billion in additional revenue. So what Congress has said, well, if we give you that money, will you maintain the system? And Amtrak CEO William Flynn answered what you see here. If that $4 billion instructs us to rescind the furloughs and rescind the service cuts, we'll do that. So that's very good news, and that's a very important point for later on in our presentation. But when you analyze what's happened to Amtrak during the COVID period, since March when ridership really collapsed, it is clear that the long distance trains are holding up much better in terms of a ridership perspective and a revenue perspective vis-a-vis the other two business units that Amtrak has, namely the Northeast Corridor and state-supported routes. The long distance trains have retained by far more ridership than the Northeast Corridor or state-supported routes. And we're just very concerned that Amtrak is making, an unwise business decision based upon how well the long-distance trains are performing. So you can see here in percent of retained ridership that the long-distance trains are doing much better than the other two business units. This next graph is actual revenue, and it's a comparison year over year in terms of, how the Northeast Corridor in green, the blue, which is the state-supported corridors, i.e. corridors of 750 miles or less, and the long-distance trains are performing. So during the pandemic since March, the national network's routes have contributed 45% of Amtrak's revenue. So that's, by far the vast majority of the revenue that they've received, compared with 21% a year ago. And since March, the Northeast Corridor and state-supported corridor revenues are down 90% compared with a 64% decline for the national network. In all of calendar 2020, Northeast Corridor ridership is down 66%, and during the pandemic period, ridership is down 88%. By contrast, the national network's ridership is only down 53%. So the long distance trains are clearly holding up. It reinforces our belief and our view. When I say our, I mean all aboard Minnesota and all aboard Wisconsin, that people depend on these trains. They, the families with kids, college students, people traveling to, remote areas of the country need these trains to get around. What this chart is showing you is I think especially interesting. It's passenger miles per train mile. And how that's defined is passenger train miles it's one passenger carried 1 mile. So again, this is a comparison between June of 2019 and June of 2020. And on the left are the 19 stats, on the right are the 20 stats. And it's very clear that, again, the long distance trains are hauling the majority of Amtrak passengers. So we don't believe that this decision to cut the long distance trains is a wise one based off how they've performed during the pandemic period. So what does this mean? So Rail Passengers Association has some excellent modeling tools, and what they've done is model the economic impact of long distance trains to the communities that they serve, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But you see the 6 national network trains that they've modeled here, that they serve 30 states, just those 6 trains alone serve 30 states, and their economic benefit overall is $2.4 billion every year. So that's a really significant number. And they did model that Amtrak's entire fleet of long distance trains, the 15 daily long distance trains, produce $4.7 billion in economic benefits. So that's extremely significant when you think about 15 trains alone contribute $4.7 billion in economic benefits. Now that includes things like payroll for Amtrak, tourism dollars for people that get off, payroll taxes, supplies and contracts, the spin-offs of all those things, jobs that it creates on Amtrak and elsewhere. So, I mean, it's a huge economic impact. With the proposed cuts, however, with the $213 million that Amtrak wants to save in the 9 months of daily service cuts, that could be a 2.3 economic bomb, literally, in what Amtrak senior management officials have called flyover country, i.e. Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Montana, places like that. So we've heard them use those terms, and so that it could mean a very severe impact, especially to smaller towns like, Wolf Point, Montana, Havre, Cut Bank, Williston, places like that, that really depend on the empire builder for economic lifeblood in the people that get on and off, and the tourism dollars created and all those types of things. And that figure could rise above $3 billion if the cuts remain in place for a full year. So this is not something that is insignificant. So our conclusion, again, all aboard Wisconsin and all aboard Minnesota, is that the intent to cut the long distance trains is more ideological than an economic one. You know, former Amtrak chief Anderson made no bones about it. He wanted to cut the long distance trains. He said it over and over and over again. And as you recall, 2 years ago, Amtrak proposed to the senators along the Southwest Chief Route that they were going to implement a bus bridge between Dodge City, Kansas, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And at the same time that they were doing that, they were investigating proposals to annul the Empire Builder between St. Paul and Spokane. So Amtrak was, you know, moving down the line of getting rid of as many long distance services as they want to. And this quote below really shocked me when he said this, when he said, "We don't want to run trains in the middle of nowhere where nobody lives." In other words, states like Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana. You know, I don't know, I live here, but, you know, so anyway, you know, Flynn, the new Amtrak CEO, Flynn, is a different person. He has made commitments to the national network, but we still believe that this initiative is suspect. And furthermore, Thomas Downs, former CEO of Amtrak in the 90s, admitted how difficult it was when you cut service on a long distance route. Spoken fairly recently about how difficult it is to restore daily service. It's not like you can just flip a switch and get these trains running again. You know, there's things like employee recertification, retraining, getting furloughed equipment back, you know, negotiating with the freight railroads to get the slots back. You know, there's just a whole host of things that are, you know, it's an arduous process to do it. It's not easy. And he was very upfront and clear about that. The other thing that we're concerned about is that Amtrak has published metrics about what it would take to restore daily service. And we don't have enough time to go into all those metrics. Many of you may have seen that already, but you know, those metrics have been roundly criticized and questioned in Congress. Our RPA has published a lot of that testimony. The Environmental Law and Policy Center has published a lot of that testimony. So, you know, the metrics themselves are, let's just say, questionable. So that's the situation. That's our view of it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nona to talk about what the impact is to you.
And once again, my name is Nona Hill. I'm the president of All Aboard Wisconsin, and I also serve on the board of the Wisconsin Association of Railroad Passengers and on the board of their Madison chapter called ProRail. The economic impacts on communities are direct. Fewer travelers mean fewer dollars spent in those communities in and around Amtrak stations. And the impact on Amtrak is, even though expenses go down with fewer trains, revenue goes down further. When Amtrak did the same thing in 1995 and went to tri-weekly trains, they had a 10% expense reduction, but they lost 50% of their revenue. Due to a lot of differences, but the truth of the matter is that on any given schedule, the fewer trains you run, passengers go down more than the percentage of trains that you're cutting. The economic impact to the states. Amtrak employees will be furloughed or let go, and they live and work in states. And losing employment means losing tax revenue and jobs. We've all states have taken a huge hit from the COVID pandemic, and to cut more jobs, and by and large, Amtrak employees have good paying jobs. These are big losses to states, and they affect all of us. As an example of the impact, Amtrak did this study, and I heard about it in 2016. And at that time, the state of Illinois was subsidizing their state-supported trains for $40 million a year. But they received over $200 million in direct economic benefit. Amtrak employees that lived in the state and were earning wages, the spending of those employees, the spending of Amtrak in the states to supply the trains, and to supply parts and equipment for the trains and direct tax revenue to the states. So this is a loss all over the country if our long distance trains are reduced. We are concerned about the possible connections between long distance trains going away. In other words, if you live in the West and take the Empire Builder to Chicago, and then you plan to continue on the Capital Limited or go south to New Orleans, if there is not a same-day connection in Chicago, you are very unlikely to buy an Amtrak ticket and then have to spend a night or two in a hotel in Chicago, when historically you could have made a connection same day. So that is one of the things that reduces the ridership even more than the number of days you're reducing the train. Smaller cities and rural areas will have even fewer options. Air and bus service has already been cut back or disappeared. And in many cases, Amtrak is the only public transportation option in small cities across the West. I've experienced it talking to people on the Empire Builder where someone was attending a funeral and they didn't really want to be on the train, but they couldn't drive. And so that was their only option. And the inconvenience factor should not be underestimated. Many Amtrak stations are unstaffed. The train stops, but there is no one to let passengers know the status of that day's train. And not everyone that rides Amtrak has a smartphone and knows enough to call to find out if the train is running that day, or might not have read about the cuts or doesn't expect them. And they show up at stations and expect to board the train and buy a ticket from the conductor. Now, this might not be the world's biggest problem, but it will certainly be a problem. And that kind of error can lead to a person being so disappointed in the system that they never ride another train. And studies have shown that if you're disappointed in a business, you tell 4 or 5 times as many people about that as if you're happy with a business. In fact, if you're happy with a restaurant, you'll generally tell 2 or 3 people. But if you get poor service, you'll tell 10 or 15. And Amtrak can't afford that kind of bad press. We need to keep the ridership up as high as possible. Passenger rail has proven to be one of the safest modes of public transportation during COVID-19. I think people are showing this by riding the long distance trains. They feel safer on the train. Driving long distances requires staying at hotels, eating in restaurants. You have a much safer, more secure environment when you're taking a train cross country. And losing this service means losing options for all of us. This quote I found from RPA, but it was in a letter to the US Senate from the Station Host Association of California. And it talked about the fact that they had noticed people were traveling for medical appointments and utilizing the long distance trains, especially the sleeping car service, to get to their appointments. So turning our long distance trains into tri-weekly service means that this entire benefit goes away. My main concern is the downfall of passenger service becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You go to tri-weekly trains, the number of passengers goes down, the revenue falls even further, and Amtrak comes back to Congress and says the nationwide passenger rail system is no longer viable. And this is just a summary of the points that we want you to think about when I turn this back over to Brian and we ask you to do something about it.
Thank you, Nona. So what we're asking for you to do, and we'll provide you with more information and resources, but Congress is considering right now, as I mentioned early on, all of these requests, for additional funding. And There's a lot of them, no question about it. Schools, small cities, states, the travel industry, as I mentioned, is all coming to Congress right now wanting additional funds to make it through this horrible time in our nation's history. But if Amtrak is going to survive without implementing these drastic cuts, they have requested, and what we're asking you to do is call your senators and have them set the Amtrak appropriation at the $5 billion pandemic coronavirus relief level, and that money is contingent upon Amtrak maintaining daily long distance trains. And so that's our ask of you. As I mentioned, as we said earlier in the presentation, William Flynn said, and it's a documented quote, if Congress instructs us to run the long distance trains daily and gives us the $5 billion, we'll do it. Congress needs to hear from you. We've made the case to you that the long distance trains are performing well, they're needed desperately more than ever, and they're an important resource that we can't let go of. And so I'm going to introduce Sean Jeans-Gail from Rail Passengers Association, Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs, to talk about where things are at in Congress right now. And when he's talking, I'm going to put up 2 slides of U.S. Senator contact information from Minnesota and Wisconsin. But with that, I'm going to let Sean give us an update in terms of where things are at in Congress, in terms of Amtrak and the long distance trains and the funding scenarios.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate you organizing this. It's a really important part of the calendar right now we are in. I think we are going to decide a lot of things over the next 7 to 10 days. We have till September 30th before a number of important pieces of legislation expire. So it's really important that everyone kind of focus in and really maintain high levels of contact with their elected officials. So you did a really excellent job of summing up the problem. I was very pleased to see a lot of the research we've been trying to disseminate incorporated into your presentation. If you haven't had a chance to see my boss, Jim Matthews, testify before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He did it September 9th this month. He makes a lot of those same points to members of Congress. And you know, I think we've been getting some reasonably positive feedback. We're hoping to advance a lot of that research over the next few days here so that we can break out. We did it by route. So the Empire, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but the Empire builder produces X hundreds of millions of dollars for the entire route it serves. We're going to break that down by states, which will hopefully be important kind of tools in your outreach kit. So look for that. As far as where things stand in Congress, Amtrak updated to $4.9 billion in I believe it was late August, which didn't really become public until the September 9th hearing. There was, frankly speaking, a lot of anger over the fact that Amtrak waited so long to produce this updated report on their supplemental needs. Certainly there's been a lot of difficulty in trying to project what ridership is going to be, what revenue is going to be. We all really hoped that the pandemic was going to be more under control in the US at this point. It is under control to a much greater degree in Europe and Asia. And so we've seen some levels of travel demand return in those continents ahead of the US. However, it is also true that international flights and domestic flights in the US are also seeing a lot of, they've seen a plateau. In fact, after initial return in demand, it bottomed out again. And so there's a lot of trouble all over the transportation industry. And so that will be a bit of a challenge in some ways in terms of making sure we we are part of the conversation. Brian, I believe, said, there's a lot of needs out there, and so making sure we're part of the conversation and our message gets through the noise is going to be difficult. However, in terms of the vehicle, which we would kind of attach the emergency relief funding for Amtrak, it does create certain opportunities, because the need for a bailout to airlines, the need for a bailout to state DOTs and highway departments, public transit agencies, they're all kind of working together to approach the problem and make sure that something gets passed by September 30th. There are 3 vehicles we are currently tracking as possible targets to attach the $4.9 billion in emergency funding for Amtrak. I'm going to present them in order of what I believe how we can most realistically achieve that goal. So the first one, and this is what we are focused on currently, is the surface transportation reauthorization. We've been working on a replacement for the FAST Act for almost 2 years now. We had a really great bill pass out of the House. The Senate has done absolutely nothing on it, so we are going to have to do a short-term extension. We've had agreement from the 4 corners, which is Senate GOP, Senate Dems, House Dems, House GOP, about the need for a 1-year extension, and they've focused on that 12-month duration, which is good to have a little bit of certainty. Now, normally when you do an extension like this, it would be current funding levels may be adjusted for inflation. However, given the incredible need facing public transit agencies, state DOTs, which have seen a severe drop-off in local state tax revenue and also gas tax revenue, there is a huge appetite among a lot of the construction industry, among AASHTO, which is the Association for State and Highway Transportation Operators, and also among public transit agencies, to see a real increase in the funding levels. So, I think it's about $37 billion for state DOTs, $32 billion for public transit agencies. They've been organizing around that, pitching that to the relevant committees. And I think, we are going to try to make the case that we support that $32 billion for transit, but we also want to make sure that Amtrak is an equal partner if that is the vehicle the relief package is passed. It's not certain. It will be attached to the continuing resolution. That's the second possible vehicle. We have to pass continuing resolution because the Congress, again, has failed to hit the deadline for coming up with fiscal year 2021 budget across a number of different silos. Again, the House did its work, passed a really good bill. We saw in fiscal year 2021, $10 billion for Amtrak, and that's $2 billion in what you would call probably normal appropriations in the normal account between National Network and Northeast Corridor. But you also saw $8 billion in almost economic stimulus funds is how they kind of envisioned it. And that would have, Amtrak came out and said, if we can get that money, not only will we not have to make these cuts, but we can actually accelerate a lot of really exciting improvement programs, capital upgrade programs, start the procurement process for new equipment for long distance routes, state supported routes. And so we were really excited to see that, but then the Senate seems to be the place where good legislation goes to die this year. They just didn't pick it up, didn't even hold Senate Appropriations Committee hearings. So, right now the White House and House Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi are in conversations about how to keep the government open past September 30th. The way they have the kind of compromise they've arrived at is they're going to have a clean extension, which, you know, they'll do some tweaks to allow for higher legislation costs. Those little tweaks on the edges, we probably won't see a lot of opportunity to attach tens of billions of dollars towards transportation, because once you open the door for that, and all of a sudden, really everyone wants to get in. So the question is, you know, as they lump together the CER and the surface transportation extension, does that cap on spending apply to the reauthorization? We don't know that answer. There will likely be votes next week on the reauthorization. We've heard indications from House Majority Whip Steny Hoyer that they will do it on the early side of the week, and then we'll have to see what happens in the Senate. These conversations are all happening at leadership level, so there will be committee chairs, ranking members involved, but it's very hard to kind of penetrate the back room which these conversations are happening. All I can say in terms of that timeline is just get on the phone with your senators as soon as possible and let them know you support Amtrak's inclusion in whatever legislation moves next week, and that you support, and this is important, protections for service and protections for workers. The final piece of legislation that we theoretically could see as a vehicle for Amtrak bailout is the next coronavirus relief package. That's a little hazier in terms of the timeline. They have tried the House has already passed the HEROES Act way back in, I want to say, May. That included $0 for Amtrak, around $16 billion for public transit. Both of those numbers are completely inadequate. That is the window that Amtrak missed. That really kind of angered a lot of House Democrats and transportation leaders in the House. We will have another bite at the apple, but what we're hearing from the White House is that they would prefer to do this after the election, which doesn't make sense from a, politics 101 point of view. Normally you want to help voters before they go vote, but for whatever reason, this seems to be, they want to kind of take politics out of it. Is there nominal reason for doing this? So this would be one of those things where if we have to wait for the next coronavirus relief package, kind of stimulus package, we will not only will we see the 3X go into service, but it will be probably a month to 2 months into the process before we can even begin directing additional funds and reversing that course. And since I saw Ross in the chat box, Ross Capon, President Emeritus of Rail Passengers Association, my former boss, he correctly identified this problem we have, which is Amtrak says we're a big ship and it takes us a while to turn, and we've already started turning towards 3X with the reservation system and with staffing choices, equipment utilization choices. So it's going to take us a while to get back, and so if we have to wait for the next coronavirus relief package and it's after the election, it's not a good situation, because what happens is we go through the holidays with 3X service, and that's going to be less than optimal for all the reasons you outlined in your excellent presentations. Two things. We're very actively working on having a conversation about the return metrics. Once we get to the point where it's clear we're not going to, and this is an if in my mind, but if we get to the point where we do not get the bailout before September 1st, we really want to strengthen those and improve those metrics of return. We've already seen our members kind of complain that Amtrak's reservation system is not handling the transition smoothly. So if you want to make a
a reservation with a connection in it, instead of suggesting some sort of workable solution. Arrow is kind of just saying no connection available to states. That's obviously going to tank ridership. That's obviously going to tank ridership well below the point where it will hit the metrics that Amtrak has identified to return to service, which will happen. They'll analyze kind of where the system stands in February. So we're having those conversations. I think our preferred solution is we just say you return. If you go to 3X, you just return on March or May of 2021, no matter what the ridership is. That's obviously not our preferred solution. Our preferred solution is we just keep running trains. It's certainly good to have a plan B. The final thing I'll say is, I'm a little concerned about the lack of urgency, not just among long distance served communities who are actually doing pretty well in terms of focusing on this because they have something tangibly at stake. There are a number of kind of state supported routes, Northeast corridor served communities who don't seem to appreciate that if we have flat funding and there is no additional supplementary emergency coronavirus funding for Amtrak, the long distance routes are not the only thing at risk here. We could see the national network get set back 10 to 15 years if Amtrak is flat funded at $2 billion because they've seen something like a 77% cut in their revenue compared to 2019. So they've already were operating at kind of cut to the bone level. And if we have to see the elimination of workers at the extent they're talking about, if we have to see the network fragmented, if we have to rely on states coming up with their Section 209 payments without federal support, we could just lose a lot of trains. And it's a lot harder to bring a train back than it is to see it go. So at that point, I will turn it over. I think I've gone over my allotted time. I apologize for that. Happy to answer questions. And thanks again for giving me the platform here.
Thank you, Sean. That was very helpful. So just a couple final things here, and then we'll open it up for questions. So obviously, you care about this issue. You're spending an hour of your life with us today, and we really appreciate that. And let's make this issue go viral. Call your friends, call your family, call your business colleagues. Tell them this issue is important to you, and it should be important to them. And one final tip, every congressional office, representatives or senators, has somebody in their office, usually in Washington, D.C. and locally, that handles transportation issues. You can call them and ask to speak with that person, and you can be sure that your voice and your vote will get counted. So just a couple tips there. The final point that I'd like to make is we have posted this information on the All Aboard Minnesota website. Here's some screenshots for you if you want to take a snapshot of this page. But if you go to our homepage, click on the About button, you'll get a drop-down menu that says News and Media. Then it'll get you to the News and Media homepage where our blog is. And we've posted all of the Minnesota and Wisconsin U.S. Senator contact information that you saw on that page, in addition to a summary of the points that we've made in this presentation. So please feel free to go to our site, visit that if you'd like more information. We have a ton of other information on our site. Why Trains has a lot of the economic benefits, FAQs about passenger rail, things like that. And again, as Mark mentioned during the opening, you can go to our site and in the Contact Us portion, if you have further questions, comments, feedback for us, you can submit it all through our site. So with that, I know you've been listening for a long time, and we've thrown a lot of information.
Sean mentioned, we have Ross Capon on the call here. Ross did have a few comments or a few points he would be interested in sharing with the group.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the great job that you all are doing, and including Sean. hiring him was one of my best moves. I wanted to point out that, underline what Nona said, and that Amtrak itself has been promoting safety during COVID. They promote their private rooms. They promote the fact that they're guaranteeing 2 seats to every single traveler. And someone had asked a question about Package Express. They're discontinuing it, except today is the last day that they're accepting Package Express, so that everything will arrive by October 1st, at which point they will suspend service until further notice. Some hot news. This morning, there was an executive session of the Senate Commerce Committee where they approved 3 more board nominees for the Amtrak board. But Senator Moran gave a really wonderful statement near the end of the session, 55 and a half minutes into it, if you go to the video. And he maintained his bipartisan approach to this, highlighting his work with Senator Udall, a Democrat, and Senator Gardner, a Republican, and indicating that he was happy with how Mayor Coos of Normal had answered his questions about the long-distance trains. He was not quite so happy with Sarah Feinberg, and so he's putting a hold on that nomination. If you heard her testimony on August 6th, it was like she seemed to simply accept everything that Amtrak was doing at face value. And then he said he's heard nothing from Todd Rokita, the former House Republican representative. So he's maintaining a hold on both Feinberg and Rokita. And my personal view is that nothing serious is going to change at Amtrak until the board changes. And I'm happy to send anyone rcapon3@gmail.com is my email address. I typed up the transcription of what Moran said. It was really an outstanding statement this morning, on top of a very good statement he made at the August 6th hearing. If anyone on here is a friend of a mayor or a business leader, get them to speak up. They carry more weight with legislators than individual members. The tri-weekly service is a disaster. It's much more impactful than just going from 7 to 3 because of all the connections that are broken. And I have a chart on my statement for the record, which shows for 6 major terminals, including Chicago and Portland, the arrival and departure times and days of operation for all the long distance trains. In 1995, for all of its faults, they generally avoided having less than daily trains connect with each other. But today, under the new system that begins next month, any train arriving from the west that misconnects, right away you know that if you want to stay on the ground, you're going to be spending 2 or 3 nights in Chicago at Amtrak's expense. So, and I might also say that Jerry Moran's statement, especially with Republican senators, like, for example, Senator Johnson, be good for them to be made aware of the strong stand that their fellow Republican maybe sets a good example for them. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for all the work that you folks are doing.
Thank you, Ross. We'll open it up for questions, and I'll turn it back to Mark to moderate those.
Thank you, Brian. And I actually have a few questions in the chat box here, and I'll start with the first question, and this is from Eldine Carpenter in Milwaukee. Eldine was interested in knowing if there isn't enough money to run all the Amtrak trains without funding from Congress, could that result in more issues? And then she also commented, Flynn said that continuing without money will result in bankruptcy and more losses. Any reaction to that question?
Well, I think Sean and Ross both answered that question by saying that without the $5 billion, we will see more cuts, not fewer.
Yeah, I think the emphasis in talking to legislators should be on what you want. You want a directive that says Amtrak must restore daily service, I would say within 6 weeks of assured funding, since Amtrak is talking about it'll take time. I would let the legislators focus on how they solve it, and it's really between them and Amtrak what the dollar figure is, because I think there's some indication that $5 billion is a little bit rich, but I don't want to go too far there. But the main message from the constituent is, this is what we want. We want daily service restored as fast as possible. And personally, I hope it's before early December, because I don't want them to go through the the December holidays without it. And I certainly don't want them to do what I'm afraid they're doing, which is paying attention to the Federal Reserve. I think they just announced near zero interest rates through something like 2024.
Okay, thank you, Ross. I do have another question in, and this is from an individual. They would like to know, what are the 3 days that the Empire Builder will run when it's on the reduced 3 times a week service?
It departs Chicago Monday, Thursday, and Saturday.
And just to let everybody know, on that news and blog site homepage, we have posted the long distance trains tri-weekly schedule on that page for your reference.
I have another question that came in here from Jeff Wells, and Jeff's question is, did I understand Ross to say that necessary lodging to make the connections in Chicago would be at Amtrak's expense? I guess maybe he's looking for some clarification on who's covering the expense.
Well, I think I think they have to. Now, they will probably offer an airplane trip or even a bus, but if the passenger is on the train because he can't fly, that's just part of the price they pay, and it's part of what undoes the savings they claim from making these reductions.
I don't know if Nona or Brian or Ross or Sean, if you have any further comments or anything you'd like to mention.
I just want to point out that that a regional representative for Senator Baldwin has offered that her region includes Columbus, Portage, and the Dells, and she can be reached. If you look through your chat box, you'll see her name is Monica Sundal, and it's Monica _SUNDAL at baldwin.senate.gov. So if you're in those areas, you may want to email her a copy of your email to the senator as well.
Okay, that's good information. I have another question that came in. This is from David. He wants to know, are there any states that could help support the Empire long distance trains?
I'd say the answer is no. We've been fighting this battle for a long time. The Brookings Institution was talking up this idea 6 or 7 years ago. And the problem is that you're never going to get states to agree on the schedule, because who wants to vote for a train that goes through at 3 a.m.? It was tried at the very beginning of Amtrak with the Lakeshore Limited, and the states said they would pay for it. They never did. The train went away, and then it came back when Congress was demanding 1 new route per year, if you can imagine that.
Question that came in from Frank. It says, how are the bus connections service affected?
There's been a significant reduction of throughway buses in California, but I think that's a function of California's budget. I don't know. And of course, the intercity bus industry as a whole is in a big hole because they didn't get any aid in the CARES Act when Amtrak did. So all of these bus connections are may be up in the air depending on the financial situation of the carriers or the particular relationship that that governs their throughway connection.
Thank you, Ross.
I don't know, Sean, if you still had some comments. I'm sorry I had problems unmuting you before here, but you're unmuted if you have some comments or anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, well, I just know that the coach industry has been extremely hard hit, and these things all vary by state in terms of the, again, state level payments and who determines what levels of service. But I would assume that they would be relatively hard hit in terms of connections. There was a question about, is calling more effective than email? From Delaney, and the answer to me is yes. It's going to be a little difficult, I think, giving staffing to get through. So you may, in DC, so you may want to try the Wisconsin or Minnesota offices, in-state offices, which I think will be a little bit more accessible. But given the timeline we have, I would encourage everyone to pick up the phone. So that these things move a little bit more quickly, because time is of the essence.
Thank you. I do have another question that came in, and this is from Thomas. He said, are there any future booking trends on the Empire Builder right now, or what might be foreseen down the road?
What we're hearing at the height of the pandemic, you know, where the Empire Builder might load, you know, 50, 75, 100 people on weekends for Chicago, St. Paul to Chicago, you know, it was down to loading, you know, 6 people a day. So from what we're hearing from SPUD ticket agents is that patronage is climbing back slowly. To Nona's point earlier, the sleepers have been relatively full on the Empire Builder route. We do know that a second Portland sleeper has been operated many days this summer. So indications are that patronage is coming back, and it's ramping up. I don't have specific figures for you. Hopefully that provides some context around that question.
Yeah, it is. And again, if you go to our website and look at the testimony, we have graphs showing the relative ridership over the summer for the 3 different business lines: state supported, Northeast Corridor, and long distance. And I can say that the long distance has been far more resilient, and that is expected to continue because while personal travel, I think is expected to rebound at a much more aggressive rate. We just know for sure, talking to hearing from other industry analysts, that business travel is going to be a lagging indicator for the travel sector. So that means the Northeast Corridor is going to be rock bottom for a while, because no one is both has the expense accounts at this point to go fund that, and no one's meeting in person. Everything is happening like this over the Zoom call. So I would expect the long distance to be far more resilient for the next year at least.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Sean, thank you for your great input and support. Ross, thank you for joining the call and providing the information that you did. Again, if you have final questions, thoughts, feedback, things that we can help with, go to allaboardminnesota.org, and in the Contact Us section, you can send us an email with your thoughts or questions. So with that, we'll do a wrap, and thank you everybody so much. And please call your senators. Please call your senators.
Yep,
Thanks,
Wisconsin
everyone.
and Minnesota. And thanks again,
Yep.
everyone. We appreciate you taking the time and joining us here today, and hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.